I knew something was wrong before I even stepped out onto the porch. You ever have one of those mornings where your stomach drops for no reason at all? Like your brain notices a problem before your eyes catch up to it? That's exactly how it felt for Martha Reynolds the morning she looked out her kitchen window and realized somebody had stolen a piece of her life overnight. Not figuratively, not emotionally, literally. For feet of her property had disappeared while she slept. A brand new fence stood where her rose garden had been the evening before, running in a perfectly straight line through flower beds she'd spent 15 years building with her own hands. And standing on the other side of it, coffee mug in hand like he was admiring a home improvement project on TV, was her neighbor, Todd Mercer. Now, if you had asked people in Willow Creek, Tennessee about Martha, most would have described her the same way. Quiet, polite, the kind of woman who still baked pies for church fundraisers and remembered everybody's birthday. She'd lived in that house for over 3 decades, raised 2 kids there, buried a husband, watched the neighborhood change around her while somehow staying exactly the same. Todd, on the other hand, had only moved in about 3 years earlier. He wasn't a bad guy exactly, at least not in the beginning. He was one of those people who always seemed convinced he was the smartest person in every room. The type who corrected contractors, argued with utility workers, and somehow managed to explain your own property to you while standing on it. At first, Martha tried to be neighborly. She brought over cookies when he moved in, helped him find local plumbers, even loaned him a ladder once. But over time, she started noticing little things. Todd always seemed obsessed with boundaries. Not emotional boundaries, property boundaries. He'd stare at lot lines during conversations, ask questions about fence placement, mention how much larger his backyard would feel if things were laid out differently. Most people would have laughed it off. Martha did too, until that morning. She stepped outside wearing gardening gloves she hadn't even realized she was still holding and just stood there staring. The fence wasn't temporary. These weren't survey stakes or construction markers. Somebody had dug post holes, poured concrete, installed pressure-treated lumber, and built nearly 60 feet of fencing in a single day. Her lavender bushes were gone. Half her rose bed had been flattened. Decorative stones her late husband had placed years ago were scattered in the dirt. For a moment, she couldn't even process the anger because the disbelief hit first. Then she spotted Todd watching her from his side. He took a sip of coffee, nodded once, almost smiled. Martha walked toward him slowly. "Morning, Todd." "Morning. You build a fence?" "Sure did." She looked at the line again. "You know that's on my property, right?" Todd actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward laugh. A confident one. The kind people use when they've already decided they're right. According to who? Martha blinked. According to the property markers that have been there for 40 years. He shrugged. "Those old markers don't mean much." "Excuse me." I checked the county website. The map shows the line differently. Martha stared at him. "The county website isn't a legal survey." "Then maybe you should get one if you think I'm wrong." There was something about the way he said it that stuck with her. It wasn't just arrogance. It was dismissal. Like he genuinely believed she didn't know what she was talking about. Like she was some confused older woman clinging to outdated information. Across the street, a neighbor named Ben had come outside to get his newspaper. He looked over, saw the tension, then immediately found something fascinating about his mailbox. Nobody wanted to get involved. Small town rule number 1. Stay out of neighbor disputes. Martha nodded once. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't threaten lawsuits. Didn't call the police. She simply said, "Okay." Then she turned around and walked back toward her house. Todd smirked. That's the part he would regret later. Because what Todd didn't know was that Martha's father wasn't just some homeowner who had guessed where his property lines were. Richard Reynolds had spent 42 years as a licensed land surveyor. Not the guy holding the measuring stick. The guy signing the official documents. The guy courts trusted when property disputes got ugly. The guy developers hired when millions of dollars depended on a boundary being correct. Back in the early 80s, Richard had purchased an adjoining parcel and merged it with the family property. And because he was Richard Reynolds, he didn't just walk the perimeter and call it good. He completed a full certified survey, filed it with the county recorder, had every document stamped, notarized, archived, and legally recorded. He used to joke that future generations could lose the house before they'd lose the paperwork. Martha hadn't thought about any of that in years. But after her conversation with Todd, she found herself walking toward the old storage shed behind the house. The same shed her father built before she got married. The same shed she hadn't opened in months. Dust floated through the sunlight as she pushed the door open. Old tools hung exactly where they'd always been. Rusted shelves lined the walls. And in the far corner sat a weathered metal toolbox with her father's initials engraved into the lid. Martha stared at it for several seconds before lifting the latch. Inside was something she hadn't seen in a very long time. And the moment she saw it, she realized Todd Mercer had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Inside that toolbox were 4 metal survey stakes, each one wrapped in old cloth and carefully labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. Martha picked one up and immediately recognized the small aluminum survey tag still attached to the top. The state registration number was visible despite decades of wear. Most people would have seen a rusty piece of metal. Richard Reynolds had seen legal evidence. And now, standing in that dusty shed, Martha suddenly understood why her father had refused to throw anything away. Richard used to say that memories were nice, but documents kept people honest. She sat down on an overturned bucket and spent the next hour digging through old folders stored beneath the toolbox. Property maps, survey notes, boundary calculations, copies of county filings. Everything organized with the kind of precision only a surveyor could appreciate. By lunchtime, she had found the original certified survey drawing from 1984, complete with county recording numbers and official seals. Todd had no idea this existed. Martha suspected he wouldn't care even if he did. Some people don't stop when they're wrong. They stop when somebody with authority tells them they're wrong. So instead of arguing, she picked up the phone and called the county surveyor's office. The woman who answered listened patiently while Martha explained the situation. When she mentioned her father's name, there was a brief pause. "Richard Reynolds?" the woman asked. "Yes." "The surveyor?" Martha smiled slightly. "That's right. I think half her archived records still have his name on them." By the end of the call, an official boundary verification had been scheduled. Meanwhile, Todd was enjoying what he believed was a victory. Over the next several days, he acted like a man who had just expanded his property without spending a dollar. He mowed grass right up against a new fence, installed decorative solar lights, even told another neighbor he was finally correcting a boundary error that had existed for years. The story began spreading through the neighborhood, and like most neighborhood stories, it changed every time somebody repeated it. Some people believed Todd. Others quietly suspected Martha was right but didn't want involvement. One afternoon, Ben, the neighbor across the street, stopped by Martha's house while she was watering plants. "You really think he's on your property?" he asked. Martha glanced at the fence. "I don't think. I know." Ben looked uncomfortable. "Todd seems pretty sure of himself." Martha laughed softly. "That's never been reliable evidence." The survey team arrived the following Tuesday. 2 county vehicles pulled up just after 8 in the morning. Todd came outside almost immediately. Martha watched from her porch as the lead surveyor introduced himself and explained the verification process. Todd's confidence was still fully intact. In fact, he looked amused. "This seems like a waste of taxpayer money," he said. The surveyor ignored the comment. "Professionals get paid to deal with people like Todd every day." The crew began locating reference points throughout the neighborhood. They reviewed historical records, checked coordinates, and compared existing monuments. Then came the moment that changed everything. Martha brought out the original survey stakes from her father's toolbox. The lead surveyor examined one carefully. His eyebrows lifted. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Another crew member looked over. "Original Reynolds markers?" The lead surveyor nodded. "Looks like it." Todd's smile faded slightly. For the first time all morning, uncertainty appeared on his face. The crew spent several hours conducting measurements. By midday, they were comparing current positions against the recorded survey filed decades earlier. Martha sat quietly on her porch the entire time. Todd paced. Every few minutes, he tried asking questions. Nobody answered. Surveyors have a habit of waiting until they're finished before discussing results. Around 2 o'clock, the lead surveyor walked directly toward the fence. He studied one measurement, checked another, then called over his assistant. They exchanged a few words. The assistant nodded. More measurements followed. Then another surveyor joined them. Martha could see the conclusion forming long before anyone officially announced it. Todd apparently could too. His posture changed. His arms uncrossed. The confidence started leaking out of him little by little. Finally, the lead surveyor approached both property owners. "We've completed the verification." Todd immediately spoke first, and the surveyor pointed toward the fence. "The structure is approximately 4 feet inside Ms. Reynolds' property line." Silence. Not the dramatic movie kind. The real kind. The uncomfortable kind, where nobody knows what to say because reality just walked into the room carrying paperwork. Todd stared at him. "That's impossible." The surveyor shrugged. "No, it's actually very possible. That's why we're here." Ben later admitted he nearly laughed when he heard that response. Todd demanded to see measurements. The surveyor showed him. Todd questioned the records. The surveyor showed him those too. Todd mentioned the online county map. At that point, the surveyor actually sighed. "Sir, the website specifically states those maps are reference tools and not legal boundary documents." Todd's face turned red. "Well, then why even put them online?" The surveyor paused. "For reference." Ben said later it took every ounce of self-control not to burst out laughing. Most people would have accepted defeat at that point. Todd wasn't most people. He spent the next several days insisting there had to be a mistake. He called county offices, asked for explanations, requested additional documentation. Every answer pointed back to the same conclusion. The fence was wrong. The survey was right. But then the situation became even worse for him. During the county review process, officials discovered something else. Todd had never obtained a construction permit before building the fence. Now, that might sound minor depending on where you live. In this county, it wasn't. Local regulations required permits for structures built along property boundaries. They also required setback compliance. Since Todd had skipped both requirements entirely, he had accidentally created multiple violations at once. What started as a property dispute was turning into a code enforcement problem. 2 weeks after the survey, an official notice appeared in Todd's mailbox. Martha never saw the document herself, but practically the entire neighborhood learned about it within 48 hours. Small towns are remarkably efficient information networks. According to Ben, who heard it from someone who heard it from someone else, the notice wasn't complicated. Remove the fence. Restore the affected area. Obtain proper permits before rebuilding. Complete an approved survey. Pay applicable penalties. Failure to comply would trigger additional enforcement action. Todd was furious. For days, he stomped around his yard making phone calls. Contractors came and went. Surveyors visited. Inspectors stopped by. Every conversation appeared to cost him more money. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Martha. The same man who had told her to get a real survey was now paying for one himself. The same man who dismissed 40 years of recorded documentation was suddenly reading county regulations line by line. One afternoon, about 3 weeks in the mess, Todd finally approached Martha while she was planting flowers near the damaged garden bed. He stood awkwardly beside the fence. "You could have just shown me the paperwork," he said. Martha looked up. "You could have just asked." Todd opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then she remembered the flattened roses, the smirk, and the way he'd looked at her like she was too old to understand her own property. Sympathy faded quickly. Neither of them realized it then, but the biggest moment in the entire story was still coming, and when it arrived, it would happen in front of half the neighborhood. The day the fence came down felt strangely bigger than a simple construction project. Maybe it was because the whole neighborhood had spent weeks watching the drama unfold. Maybe it was because everyone secretly wanted to know how it would end. Or maybe it was because people have a natural attraction to consequences, especially when those consequences finally catch up with someone who spent too long believing they were untouchable. Either way, by 8 o'clock that Saturday morning, there were more curtains moving and front porches occupied than anyone wanted to admit. Martha noticed it immediately. Ben was watering the same patch of grass he'd already watered twice. Mrs. Carter across the street suddenly found a reason to drink coffee outside. Even a few people walking their dogs seemed to slow down whenever they reached that section of the block. Then the contractor's truck arrived. A crew stepped out and immediately began removing panels. The sound of drills echoed through the neighborhood. One section after another disappeared. It was surprisingly fast. Something that had taken Todd days to build came apart in only a few hours. Martha sat quietly on her porch and watched, not smiling, not celebrating, just observing. There was something almost poetic about it. Every fence board being loaded into the trailer represented a decision Todd had made. Every post being pulled from the ground represented an assumption that turned out to be wrong. Around mid-morning, one of the workers reached the section that had cut through Martha's rose bed. As the panel came down, sunlight touched that part of the garden again for the first time in weeks. Martha felt something tighten in her chest. Those flowers weren't expensive. The land itself wasn't worth a fortune. But ownership isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about respect. Sometimes it's about being told you don't matter, then proving that you do. Todd spent most of the morning outside as well. He looked exhausted, not angry anymore, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from fighting reality for too long. At one point, Ben wandered over and struck up a conversation with him. Nobody knows exactly what was said. Ben later claimed he was being polite. Todd later claimed he was being mocked. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. By lunchtime, the fence was completely gone. The property line was visible again exactly where it had always been. 4 feet of ground had returned to its rightful place without moving an inch. That's the funny thing about facts. They don't care how confident somebody sounds. A month later, most of the physical evidence had disappeared. Martha replanted flowers where the fence once stood. New mulch covered the damaged soil. Fresh lavender began growing. Life slowly returned to normal. But something inside Martha had changed. One evening, she walked back into the old shed and opened her father's toolbox again. She held one of the survey stakes in her hand and remembered being a little girl riding in his truck while he explained why measurements mattered. Back then, she thought he was talking about land. Now she realized he had been talking about character. Richard used to say that lines exist for a reason. Property lines, ethical lines, personal lines. Problems start when people convince themselves those lines don't apply to them. Martha smiled as she placed the marker back inside the box. She never expected those old tools to protect her decades after her father was gone. Yet somehow they had. Not because they were magical, not because they carried sentimental value, because they represented truth documented carefully enough to survive arrogance. As for Todd, he eventually rebuilt a new fence. This time it was installed legally, professionally surveyed, fully permitted, and positioned exactly where it belonged. The two neighbors never became friends again. They remained civil. They waved occasionally. They exchanged short greetings when necessary. But the easy trust that once existed never returned. And honestly, that's the part of this story people argue about the most. Some folks say Martha should have accepted an apology and moved on completely. Others say Todd got exactly what he deserved and was lucky the situation didn't end up in court. Personally, I think both sides miss something important. The real lesson isn't about fences. It's about what happens when confidence replaces humility. Todd wasn't defeated by lawyers, money, or some elaborate revenge plan. He was defeated by evidence, by patience, by a woman who understood that sometimes the strongest response isn't fighting louder. It's simply letting the facts do the talking. And maybe that's why this story still gets discussed around Willow Creek years later. Not because somebody lost a fence, but because somebody learned that being absolutely certain doesn't automatically make you right. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in Martha's position, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have taken legal action the moment the fence went up? And if you were Todd, would you have admitted your mistake after the survey? Or kept fighting the county's decision? Let me know down in the comments, because these neighbor disputes always seem to divide people right down the middle. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's dealt with a difficult neighbor before. Sometimes the smallest property line can create the biggest battle. And sometimes the oldest piece of evidence can end the argument once and for all.